In one of China's crowded port cities more than a century ago, bubonic plague was moving through the workers' quarters. And a young clerk for the richest Jewish trading house in Asia did something his bosses had not authorized. He went to the company stores, pulled out barrels of disinfectant, and handed them to the Chinese laborers to carry home and protect their families. When the firm found out he had given away company goods, they reprimanded him. So he quit. That decision, born from a small act of kindness that got a young man in trouble, would grow into one of the great fortunes of Asia. And here is the strange part. The family he walked away from, the Sassoons, the people who built the skyline of old Shanghai, would lose almost everything and all but vanish from the history books. His family is still here today, richer and more respected than ever. So how does a penniless clerk end up outlasting the empire he was hired to serve? And where are his descendants now? This is the story of the Kadoories, the Baghdadi Jewish family who helped build old Shanghai and then quietly outlived it. Before we go back to the beginning, a quick word. If you're the kind of person who loves a story about ordinary people who crossed the world with almost nothing and built something extraordinary, do yourself a favor and subscribe. You're going to want to see where this one goes. Half a century before the Kadoorie name was attached to the company that powers most of Hong Kong and to some of the most celebrated hotels on earth, it belonged to a teenager stepping off a steamer into a world that was not his own. His name was Eliezer Silas Kadoorie, though everyone called him Elly. He came from Baghdad, from a Jewish community that had lived along the banks of the Tigris for well over 2,000 years. They had traded there, farmed there, and worshipped there since the days of ancient Babylon. And for centuries, Baghdad had been one of the great centers of the Jewish world. But by the late 1800s, life for Baghdadi Jews was getting harder, and opportunity was pulling east, out along the trade routes to British India and the ports of China. So Elly did what thousands of young men in his community were doing in those years. He left home. He traveled by way of Bombay and arrived in the Far East in 1880 to take a job as a lowly clerk. His wage was 37 rupees a month. His employer was the House of Sassoon. To understand how small Elly was in that world, you have to understand how Sassoons were. People called them the Rothschilds of the East, and they had earned the name. Their patriarch, David Sassoon, had fled Baghdad decades earlier to escape a hostile ruler, rebuilt his fortune from scratch in Bombay, and then sent his 8 sons fanning out across Asia to run a trading empire. They dealt in cotton, silk, spices, tea, and, to the family's later unease, opium, which the British had forced open across China. By the time young Elly arrived, Sassoon money was already reshaping Shanghai. Their warehouses lined the waterfront district known as the Bondi. Their offices ran the China trade. Their schools even trained young Baghdadi Jews like Elly to become the next generation of Sassoon employees. If you had stood on the Bondi in 1880 and asked who owned the future of this city, no one would have pointed to the teenage clerk keeping ledgers in a back office. They had no idea what he would become. For a few years, Elly did exactly what a clerk was supposed to do. He kept the accounts, managed shipments, and moved between the treaty ports where the Sassoons traded up and down the China coast. And then came the outbreak. Plague had reached one of the port cities where Elly was posted, and it was tearing through the crowded quarters where the Chinese dock workers and their families lived. Elly reached for the company's supply of disinfectant and began handing it out, so ordinary laborers could protect their homes against a disease that was killing people around them. It was a decent human thing to do. It was also, in the strict eyes of the firm, giving away goods that belonged to the Sassoons without permission. He was reprimanded for it. And Elly Kadoorie, proud and stubborn and still a young man, decided he had had enough of taking orders from someone else. He resigned. He walked away with almost nothing to his name. What he did have was a reputation for being sharp, honest, and hard-working, and a brother who believed in him. That brother pressed $500 into his hands and told him to go build something of his own. $500. That was the entire seed of what came next. Elly used it to set himself up as a broker in Hong Kong, buying and selling shares and commodities on behalf of other people. And it turned out he had a real gift for it. Within a few years, the small brokerage he helped found had become one of the most trusted houses in the colony, handling business for some of Hong Kong's biggest names. It seemed like a minor moment at the time, a headstrong young man quitting his job over a barrel of disinfectant. It wasn't minor at all. In fact, the family would later joke that they ought to put a barrel of disinfectant on their coat of arms, because that one stubborn act of conscience was the exact moment the Kadoorie fortune began. Elly was building far more than a brokerage. In the 1890s, he traveled to London, and there he met Laura Mokata, who came from a distinguished Sephardi Jewish family that had lived in England for generations. They married in 1897. Laura was a painter, a diarist, and a fearless traveler, and she became the emotional heart of Elly's life. Together, they began raising a family and dividing their time between London, Hong Kong, and Shanghai as Elly's business interests spread across the map. And those interests grew fast. Pay attention to this next part because it explains everything that came after. Elly did not gamble everything on one lucky score. He spread his money deliberately across the things a modern city simply could not function without. He bought into rubber plantations, right as the automobile was creating a worldwide hunger for tires. He acquired real estate in both Hong Kong and Shanghai as those two cities exploded in size and wealth. He took stakes in banking, in the docks, in public transport, and, most importantly of all, he moved into two businesses that would carry his family for the next 100 years. One was a hotel company based in Hong Kong. The other supplied electricity. Neither one looked glamorous on a balance sheet. Both of them turned out to be gold. His brothers were part of the story too, and together the Kadoories became one of the most quietly powerful business families along the whole China coast. Think about that arc for a second. A boy arrives in the East on 37 rupees a month with a supervisor watching his every move. A brother stakes him $500, and within 2 decades, that same man is one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in Asia, sitting on the boards of the companies that light the streets and house the travelers of 2 great cities. It's the kind of before and after that makes accountants blink and read the page again. But wealth does not protect anyone from grief. In 1919, a fire broke out at the family's home on Bubbling Well Road in Shanghai. Elly and the children escaped. Laura did not. She had run back into the burning house to save the family's young governess, and she died doing it. Elly Kadoorie, a man who had built an entire fortune out of almost nothing, could not save the one person who meant everything to him. He never truly recovered from losing Laura, and he never remarried. In the years that followed, Elly poured himself into 2 things: his sons and the building of something permanent. On a broad stretch of that same Shanghai Avenue, he raised a mansion unlike anything the city had ever seen. They called it Marble Hall. It was modeled on the great palaces of Europe, with a grand ballroom, a dining room that could seat 50 guests, and a garage large enough for a fleet of Rolls-Royces. It was said to be the largest private residence in all of Shanghai. Famous visitors passed through its doors, from the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore to the first American aviators to fly around the world. For a family that had arrived in the East as clerks, Marble Hall was a quiet declaration that the Kadoories had truly arrived. But here is what mattered more than the marble. Elly Kadoorie believed something very specific about money, and he said it in plain words. Wealth, he said, is a sacred trust to be administered for the good of society. He did not treat that as a pretty saying to hang on a wall. He and his brother Ellis built schools and hospitals across Asia and the Middle East. They funded education for girls and women at a time when almost no one else would pay for it. They gave quietly, steadily, and on an enormous scale, often to people who had no idea where the money had come from. That belief, that wealth, is something you hold in trust for others, is the thread that runs through everything the Kadoories are about to do, and it is the reason this story is worth telling at all. While Marble Hall was filling with guests in Shanghai, the Kadoorie name was rising over an entirely different city. In 1928, a hotel opened on the Kowloon waterfront in Hong Kong, facing out across the harbour, with a stately colonnaded front and a green roof that would become one of the most recognised silhouettes in all of Asia. It was called the Peninsula. When it opened, people described it as the finest hotel east of Suez, and the Kadoories were major owners of the company behind it. At the same time, the family was deepening its hold on China Light and Power, the utility that would one day light up most of Hong Kong. Hotels and electricity, guests and power. It was the exact same instinct that had guided Elly from his very first investments. Back in Shanghai, meanwhile, the rivalry between the Kadoories and the Sassoons had become almost theatrical. In 1929, Victor Sassoon opened his own masterpiece on the Bund. Victor was the sharp, witty heir to the old Sassoon Empire, a man who had been left disabled by a crash during the First World War and walked with 2 canes, but who still ran his world with enormous style. His new building was the Cathay Hotel, a tower of Art Deco stone crowned with a green copper pyramid, and it was designed to outshine everything around it, including the Kadoories' own majestic hotel. The Cathay drew the famous from around the globe. Charlie Chaplin stayed there. Noel Coward wrote part of a play in one of its suites. So there they were, 2 Baghdadi Jewish families, who had started out in the very same trading firm, now competing to define the skyline of the richest city in Asia. Their hotels, their mansions, their fortunes, all of it looked permanent, carved in stone and marble to last for centuries. And here is a small thing worth holding on to, because it is going to matter enormously very soon. Even as the Sassoons poured almost everything into Shanghai, the Kadoories kept building on the other side of the water, in Hong Kong. At the time, it looked like ordinary expansion. It was about to become the difference between survival and ruin, but that is getting ahead of the story. By the middle of the 1930s, the world beyond Shanghai was turning dangerous in a way that would test what the Kadoories actually believed. In Germany, and then in Austria, the Nazi regime was stripping Jews of their rights, their livelihoods, and finally their safety. Jews who tried to flee ran into closed door after closed door. Country after country tightened its immigration quotas and turned desperate refugees away at the border. But there was one major city on Earth that required no visa at all to enter. That city was Shanghai. Because of the unusual way the city was governed, a Jewish family fleeing Vienna or Berlin could step off a ship there without papers, without a sponsor, without permission from anyone. And so they came. Tens of thousands of Jewish refugees, most of them from Germany and Austria, made the long journey by sea to a Chinese city on the far side of the planet, often arriving with a single suitcase and no money at all. By the time the war fully closed in, roughly 18,000 Jewish refugees had found shelter in Shanghai. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. In a decade when the world was slamming its doors on Jewish families, one of the few places left open was a treaty port in China. And the people who helped hold that door open were the same Baghdadi Jews who had built their fortunes on that very waterfront. The Kadoories did not watch it all from behind the gates of Marble Hall. Elly's younger son, Horace, threw himself into the work. In 1937, he founded an organization to care for the flood of refugee children arriving in the city, and in 1939, he opened a school for them. Its purpose, in Horace's own words, was to relieve suffering and to bring happiness to children who had lost everything they had ever known. Hundreds of refugee children walked through its doors to learn English, study their lessons, sing, and find a little bit of stability in a city that must have felt like the far edge of the world. And the help did not stop at the school. As refugees moved through the wider region, some of them passed through Hong Kong, where the Kadoories controlled that grand green-roofed hotel on the Kowloon waterfront. When a group of nearly 300 refugees found themselves suddenly stranded in the city, their onward ship pulled away for war duty, Lawrence Kadoorie, Elly's older son, did something you would never expect from the owner of a luxury hotel. He turned the peninsula's ballroom into a dormitory. He lined up cots across that polished floor and housed those refugees for months, until safe passage could finally be arranged for them. The finest hotel east of Suez, filled with families sleeping under its chandeliers. That is the kind of detail you simply do not forget. Back in Shanghai, Elly Kadoorie and his old rival Victor Sassoon did something even more surprising. They set the rivalry aside. Both men used their money, their connections, and their standing with the Japanese authorities, who now controlled parts of the city to help keep the refugee community protected, fed, and safe. Two families who had spent decades competing to build the tallest tower ended up finding their truest legacy in something much quieter, keeping thousands of frightened strangers alive. Many of those refugees would spend the war years in a poor, cramped district of Shanghai called Hongkou, packed into narrow lanes and shared rooms, surviving on aid and grit. Conditions were hard, and not everyone made it. But the great majority did survive, and many of them never forgot who had helped them when the rest of the world looked away. Among the children who grew up in those Shanghai years were people who went on to become artists, scholars, and professors on the other side of the world. They carried the memory of that city with them for the rest of their lives. If you have made it this far into the story, you are the kind of person who wants the history most people scroll straight past. So do me a favor and subscribe, and the next family we bring back from the edge of being forgotten won't slip by you. By 1941, the Shanghai that had made the Kadoories was already slipping away. Japan had gone to war with the West, and its forces seized full control of the city. The glittering international Shanghai of the 1930s, with its racecourses, its jazz clubs, its grand hotels and grander mansions, was coming to an end. For the foreign business families who had ruled the city for generations, the walls were closing in. Elly Kadoorie was in his 70s by now, and frail. In 1942, Japanese authorities came to Marble Hall and took him from his own home. The man who had arrived in the East as a boy with 37 rupees in his pocket, who had built schools across 2 continents and helped shelter thousands of refugees, was now interned as an enemy civilian in a camp for foreigners. These were grim places, overcrowded and short on food and medicine, holding thousands of British, American, and other foreign residents who had once lived at the very top of Shanghai society. His beloved mansion was confiscated, and in 1944, still held, still cut off from the empire he had spent more than 60 years building, Elly Kadoorie died. He never got to see how the story ended. He never saw his sons rebuild everything he had lost, and then far more on top of it. His son Lawrence spent part of the war interned as well, carrying a prisoner's pass through the streets of an occupied city that his own family had helped build. Everything the Kadoories owned seemed to be hanging by a thread. And yet, up to this point in their history, the family had always somehow found a way to come out ahead. That resilience was about to be tested like never before. Because when the war finally ended, an even greater reckoning was waiting for them. One that would sweep away almost everything the family still owned in the city where it had all begun. When the Second World War finally ended in 1945, the two Baghdadi families tried to pick up where they had left off. Lawrence and Horace Kadoorie returned to Shanghai and to Hong Kong and set about rebuilding what the war had damaged. But history was moving faster than they were. China slid almost immediately into a full civil war, and by 1949, the communist forces led by Mao Zedong had won it. A new government took power, one that had no place in it for foreign tycoons, private empires, or the old world of the treaty ports. Some people saw exactly what was coming. A handful of clear-eyed observers warned the foreign business families that the world they had known was ending, and that they should move whatever they could while there was still time. Victor Sassoon in particular did not truly believe it. He had kept the great bulk of the Sassoon fortune tied up in Shanghai real estate, convinced that the good times would always come back. They did not. When the new government took control of the city, the Sassoons lost an estimated $500 million, a sum that would be several billion in today's money. That is not a typo. $500 million gone, almost overnight. An embittered Victor Sassoon left China for good, eventually settling in the Bahamas, and he never rebuilt. The Sassoon fortune, once the largest in all of Asia, quietly drained away over the following years, and the family that had done so much to shape the Bund faded slowly out of the history books. The Kadoories were hit hard too. They lost Marble Hall and very nearly all of their holdings inside Shanghai. A few years later, the great mansion was handed over to Sung Ching-ling, the widow of Sun Yat-sen, and it was turned into a children's palace, a place where local children came to learn music, dance, and art. Remarkably, it still serves that exact purpose today. If the Kadoories had kept everything invested in Shanghai the way the Sassoons had, this would be the end of the story. One more fallen dynasty, one more grand name swallowed by history. But it wasn't the end at all. It was only the halfway point. Remember that quiet decision to keep building in Hong Kong, the one that looked like nothing more than ordinary expansion at the time? This is the moment it saved them. Because while Shanghai was closing itself off from the outside world, Hong Kong stayed open for business. It was still under British administration, still a place where a family could own a hotel and a power company and hold on to both. Everything the Kadoories had patiently built on that side of the water was still theirs. But the Kadoories weren't done, not even close. Lawrence and Horace took what remained and rebuilt on a scale their father might not have believed possible. Lawrence poured himself into China light and power. As Hong Kong exploded after the war into one of the great manufacturing centers of the world, his company supplied the electricity that ran the textile mills, and then the plastics factories, and then the electronics plants that turned the city into an economic miracle. Every time Hong Kong reinvented itself, Kadoorie power was running underneath it. The peninsula, meanwhile, anchored a growing hotel empire. Within a single generation, the Kadoories were widely described as Hong Kong's first billionaire family, and they carried their father's belief with them the whole way. Horace, in particular, spent decades on a cause that was close to his heart, helping the refugees and poor farmers who had flooded into Hong Kong from the mainland by the hundreds of thousands. Rather than simply hand out cash, he set up an agricultural aid association that gave farmers piglets, chicks, seed, tools, small loans, and training, so that people could feed themselves and stand on their own 2 feet. Tens of thousands of families climbed out of poverty because of that work. The boy who was once punished for handing out disinfectant to sick workers had raised sons who gave away far more than a barrel of disinfectant and asked for nothing at all in return. So where are the Kadoories now? This is where the story takes a turn almost nobody outside of Hong Kong sees coming. They did not fade. They did not fall. They are today one of the wealthiest and most respected families in all of Asia. Lawrence's son, Sir Michael Kadoorie, was born in 1941, the same year the war began closing in on his grandfather. Michael now sits at the head of the family's businesses. China Light and Power, the utility his family bet on more than a century ago, today supplies electricity to around 80% of Hong Kong, powering the homes and towers of one of the densest cities on Earth. The peninsula has grown into a collection of some of the most admired hotels in the world, from Hong Kong to Tokyo to Paris to New York to London. The family's charitable foundation still gives generously, still funding schools, hospitals, and medical research, still operating on Elly Kadoorie's old principle that wealth is a trust to be used for the good of others. And the next generation is already stepping forward. Michael's son, Philip Kadoorie, took his place as deputy chairman of the family's hotel group at the very start of 2025, becoming the fourth generation to carry the name into the business. But the detail that lands the hardest is this one. In 2010, the peninsula opened a brand new luxury hotel in Shanghai, standing on the very waterfront where the Sassoons and the Kadoories had once competed to touch the sky. Think about what that means. After everything, the war, the internment, the death of Elly, the loss of Marble Hall, the family that began as clerks came back to the city where it all started. Not as refugees this time, and not as employees, but as owners. The clerks had outlasted the kings. And when Shanghai lovingly restored Victor Sassoons' old Cathay Hotel, now known as the Peace Hotel, the officials there hung a portrait of its original owner back on the wall. In the end, in their own ways, both families finally got to come home. Think back to where all of this started. A young clerk in a plague-stricken port, quietly handing out barrels of disinfectant to frightened workers and losing his job for the trouble. He could not possibly have known that his stubbornness on that single day was the opening move in a story that would run for more than 100 years. A story that would stretch across Baghdad, Bombay, Shanghai, and Hong Kong through fortunes won and lost and won all over again, through war, exile, and an unlikely homecoming. What survived in the end was not the marble or the money. Those things came and went, as they always do. What survived was the idea that Elly Kadoorie said out loud all those years ago, that wealth is a sacred trust, to be administered for the good of society. You can see that idea in the schools, in the refugee children who found a classroom on the far side of the world, in a hotel ballroom lined with cots, in the farmers who were handed a future instead of just a handout. And you can see it, most beautifully of all, in the mansion the family lost. Marble Hall stands to this day, filled not with Rolls Royces, but with children learning to paint and to play music. Somehow, that feels exactly right. Now, I would love to hear from you. If your own family carried something across an ocean, a language, a trade, a recipe, a mem, and built it back up from nothing on the other side, tell me about it down in the comments. Some of the most remarkable stories I have ever come across started in exactly that way, with one determined person and almost nothing else. And if the Kadoories have left you wondering which other families quietly shaped a great city and then slipped out of the history books, stay close. The next one is already on the way.